All right. Good day, everyone. And thank you for joining today's Ask Me Anything, where we answer your questions about cannabis legalization in New York. We do this every Wednesday at 4:20 p.m. New York City time. I'd like to welcome back those of you who have joined us before. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I hope you will make it a regular occurrence. My name is Jeffrey Hoffman, and I am an attorney in New York whose legal practice focuses entirely on cannabis. If you would like to contact me, you can do that here on LinkedIn. I welcome all connection requests, or you can reach out to me at my email address, which you see at the bottom of the screen here, info@420jurist.com, which I guess you might say makes me the 420 jurist. And as the 420 jurist, I will be answering your questions, roughly half of them from a list of questions which we've gotten from previous Ask Me Anything sessions, and roughly half of the questions which you post in the comments here today. So if you'd like to ask a question, now is indeed the time to do it. I am now going to make my usual attorney disclaimer, and that is that I am indeed an attorney, but I am not your attorney, at least not yet. For those of you in the audience today that are actually already my clients, don't worry. You are still, I am still your attorney. But for the rest of you, I am definitely not your attorney. And today's event is not legal advice. It does not create an attorney client relationship. And it is not a solicitation to offer legal advice or legal services. I do have one programming note that I would like to make before we get started, and that is that we are double dipping this week. In addition to today's session, on Friday, I will be speaking at the NECAN event up in Albany at 3:30 p.m. And for that event, we're going to be doing that roughly half as a presentation and half as a live Ask Me Anything. So if you're going to be at NECAN or if you're in the Albany area, would welcome seeing you and in fact meeting you at the event. And of course, we'll look forward to seeing you hopefully at my session. And of course, Miss Lawley, we look forward to being at your session, which is on Saturday. And of course, visiting with you. We always have a great time when we're together. And so, with that, let's get to the questions. So, the first question is actually quite relevant to what is going on here in New York City right now. And the question is, the weed trucks breaking the law, now selling weed all over Manhattan. Do you feel they will get licensed? And so, what is being asked in that question is over the last several weeks, a number of the vehicles in New York City that have been selling both CBD and cannabis. In fact, if you looked at an interview that was done on Pix 11 with the gentleman that owns the Weed World trucks, which are the most pervasive trucks here in the city, he actually discussed on that interview that, in fact, his trucks are not selling THC full cannabis, but rather are only selling CBD. And so recently, about 20 of the Weed World trucks were impounded due to them having about $200,000 in parking tickets. And much more recently, in fact, in the last week or so here, an additional 19 or so trucks were seized in the Times Square area. And there was a lot of, I guess, speculating here in the cannabis world that perhaps this was the first enforcement by New York authorities against cannabis. And I want to make it clear to everyone that while maybe some people were thinking about that, that was definitely not why this enforcement action happened, or indeed why it was possible. As far as cannabis goes in New York City, it has been made very clear to the police in the city that they are to be hands off, that there is to be no enforcement against entities illegally selling cannabis or doing anything of that nature here in the city. And in fact, the entities, the reason why these trucks were seized here in New York recently is simply because they were not vending, or I guess I should say they were vending without a vending license. And so here in New York City, those of you that are familiar with all of the food carts, which most of the food vendors on the sidewalks and on the streets here in the city are carts, actually on the sidewalks. All of those units that are vending, typically they're halal carts or some other type of food that's being vended, they all must have a mobile vending permit from the Department of Health here in New York City. So if you want to be vending on the sidewalk using a cart, or if you want to be vending as a truck where you park on the curb and in the street and then vend to people that are standing on the curb, anyone that wants to vend in that capacity must have a mobile vending permit from the Department of Health in New York City. So all of the Weed World trucks that have been vending, frankly, forever here in New York City, they've frankly been vending illegally the entire time. So this enforcement action that was precipitated by the Times Square BID, that is Business Improvement District, all over New York City and all of the commercial regions, there are these business improvement districts, and their role is to help keep the BID area clean, help it the quality of life, both for the individuals that live in the district and for the businesses that operate in the district. That is the BID's role, to enhance the quality of life for all of those entities. And so what happened here is the Times Square BID called the police department and said, we think we have a bunch of vehicles here that are vending without the required permits, and we would appreciate it if you would investigate, and if they are indeed vending without the appropriate permit, that you will enforce appropriately. And that is exactly what happened. None of these trucks had the appropriate permit, and frankly, you can't get that permit these days in New York City. The city is going to be giving out an additional couple hundred each year over the next several years. Excuse me. But by and large, those permits are all spoken for. And there's a tremendous backlog of folks attempting to get that permit with the Department of Health. So these trucks, these Weed World trucks, and the few other brands that were seized, they couldn't apply for this permit. And if they had applied for it, they would not have been given it, because when they went to the Department of Health to have their pre-permitting inspection, and when the Department of Health reviewed what it is they were vending, they would determine that these vendors were trying to vend a product for which they did not have a license from the appropriate regulator. That is, they do not have a license to sell cannabis from the Office of Cannabis Management. And therefore, the Department of Health would not have given any of these trucks the permit that they needed to be able to vend, either parked on the streets or from the sidewalk. So these trucks were all operating illegally because they did not have this vending permit. They couldn't have gotten it if they tried. And for those reasons, I do not believe that these trucks will ever be allowed to get licensed. If you look at the cannabis law, it does say that dispensaries have to operate from a store, and then it goes on to define what is meant by a store. And these trucks clearly do not meet that definition. So without some further regulation from the Cannabis Control Board or a modification to the law, none of these trucks, in my opinion, will ever be able to get licensed here in New York. That would require a modification in the law or perhaps some additional regulation from the Cannabis Control Board. So we know everybody saw a lot about that here in the news, and that's where things stand with those trucks vending without the appropriate license from the OCM and without the appropriate permit from the Department of Health. And so, quite fascinating what went on along those lines. We had a question come in from the comments. Any insight on the expected packaging regulations? You're hearing that anything containing plastic has to be made with at least 50% post-consumer resin. And we do have some initial proposed regulations from the Cannabis Control Board. We are currently waiting to see what is going to happen as far as final regulations and where we're going to stand with that with finality. I do believe the initial 60-day public comment window has closed. So we're now simply waiting to find out if the OCM or the CCB are going to make any changes and have to go through the 45-day revised rulemaking period, or whether or not they're going to once again do damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead, and off we go with that regulation and moving forward. Now, I do think we're going to see quite a bit more about sustainability regarding particularly the packaging requirements. I do think there's going to be a tremendous push here in the state of New York for as much as possible the packaging being sustainable, including being made from recycled products, not being single use, such that not only do the products that are being sold come from previously recycled goods, but that the packaging, once it gets sold and the product that was in it gets consumed, that packaging will be recycled yet again. So I'm a big fan of that. I absolutely think there should be such sustainability requirements here in the state. And I think we'll see further clarification from that from the Cannabis Control Board as far as how they want to deal with that in regulation in the coming weeks and months. So I do think that will be very significant. Another question here from the comments. Am I allowed to just ask a question here? And the answer is yes, you are. And in fact, your question is now getting answered. And the question is, I'd like to understand what New York intends to do for provisioning dispensaries. I'm assuming they will allow imports from other states. Is that correct? So it depends on what exactly you're asking. They're certainly not going to allow the importation of product grown or processed in other states. All of the cannabis and cannabis products that are going to get sold in the state of New York will have to have been grown and processed here in the state. So there will not be any room for any products that are getting grown or processed in other states to come into New York. All cannabis products will have to be grown and processed here. If instead you're talking about will other brands or other entities that have dispensaries in other states be able to come into the state and apply for licenses and have dispensaries here, the answer is yes. They will be limited to 3 dispensaries if that's what they want to do. If they simply want to get their brand on the shelves of other dispensaries, they will have to first partner with a cultivator to get the cannabis for their products grown in the state. They will have to partner with a processor to get the products that they want to sell processed in the state. And then, of course, they will need to get demand from the dispensaries. So they want to work with dispensaries and partner with them to get the dispensaries to indicate to distributors that there is demand for that particular product at the dispensary. And then those dispensaries will reach out to the distributors who will be providing all of the product to the dispensaries, that there is demand for those products, and that ideally those products will flow from the distributors to the dispensaries as is appropriate. And as Nicole just mentioned, yes, tomorrow the Cannabis Control Board is opening the conditional adult use retail dispensary license application. So we'll do a few more questions about that here in just a second. I don't know that I would encourage anyone to try to log in tomorrow. My guess is that the Business Express website will likely crash or be unavailable due to that. The fact that tomorrow is the first day. Hopefully, they're going to get a lot of extra servers up and running to deal with the demand, and maybe they'll hold up. But my bet is we've seen just about every time on the first day an application gets released everywhere, either the website is very slow or frankly the whole thing just crashes. So I'm not sure I'd encourage anybody to try tomorrow, but if you want to, give it a try and you'll find out how it works. Now, somebody else asked, will I be in Albany this weekend? And yes, indeed, I will be in Albany this weekend, heading up there, frankly, tomorrow. So if folks are already in Albany or going to be coming to Albany, want to party in Albany tomorrow, reach out to me via LinkedIn because I am going to be looking to party tomorrow, Friday, and at least for part of Saturday with all of the folks in the cannabis industry and otherwise that are coming to Albany. So look forward to seeing everybody there. All right, let's get to a few more of the conditional adult use retail dispensary application questions. The next one we got is, who will qualify for the August 25th application and license? Are convictions that resulted in a conditional discharge eligible? And will convictions be prioritized? Will a misdemeanor conviction carry more weight than a violation? So lots of really good questions there related to the license. So let's unpack those. So who qualifies? So there's two qualifying conditions, at least today. Things may change, but it would surprise me if they would change considering that the application is being opened tomorrow. So the qualifying requirements are that the individual who's applying as the justice-involved individual was convicted of a cannabis offense in the state of New York prior to March 31st, 2021. It does appear now that the guidance that it has been given is that you can either be convicted of the cannabis offense, or if you were arrested for the cannabis offense, and then as part of the same transaction, you were eventually convicted for another crime. So, for example, you were arrested for a cannabis offense, and then eventually that arrest was pled down to, for example, loitering, and you were convicted of that or pled guilty to that, that would also qualify. If you looked in the original language of the regulation, it was clear then that only the conviction for a cannabis offense would qualify, but there has been additional guidance in various other places by the Cannabis Control Board, by the Office of Cannabis Management, that they are going to allow, if you were simply arrested for the cannabis offense and then that was somehow pled down to some other type of offense that was not specifically a cannabis offense, that is going to count as well. And then the other requirement is that you must demonstrate that you are at least a 10% owner of a business that was profitable in any 2 years. So those are the two requirements that would qualify an individual to be an applicant for this conditional adult use retail dispensary license. The next question related to that is, if what happened resulted in a conditional discharge, and what I think the person is asking about there is an adjournment in contemplation of dismissal. So in that case, that is not a conviction. That particular element is where they say, we're going to stop the court proceeding. You're not going to plead guilty today. We're not going to try you and either convict you or what have you. We're going to adjourn. And in a year, if you've behaved and had no other issues, we're going to dismiss the charge. And so that did not result in any conviction. And so therefore, if that is what has happened, that is not a qualifying conviction. So you will not be able to get the license if that was the case. So just very important that people understand potentially how that is going to work. Let's see what the other question was here. The prioritization, and I see that we've had a few questions about that. So the way that you're going to get points for this application, and it's unfortunate that at this point we've not seen how many points are going to be given based on what kind of criteria. But it does seem that the way the state is going to do it is that they're going to give points based on a number of things. So, for example, in addition to the individual that was convicted of a crime, various other individuals related to that individual are also eligible to apply for this license. So, for example, if you were the parent of someone that was convicted of a cannabis offense, or if you were the child of someone that was convicted of a cannabis offense. Those individuals are also eligible to apply, but they will get less points on the application than individuals that are specifically the individual that was convicted. Similarly, depending on what the qualifying business was, if it was a retail oriented business where the individual that was convicted dealt with people from the public and at a retail level offered goods and services to the public, you could see that's very much like a dispensary. So, for example, a bodega owner. Since that looks like a dispensary and the state really wants individuals that have experience that's going to help them operate the business, you're going to get more points for that than if your business was not a retail oriented business where you dealt with the public and did retail. It would very much there be much more the if you didn't sell to the public, that is not going to get you as many points. So those are some of the criteria. You can certainly go and look at the fact that the Office of Cannabis Management has, which will talk about more things. Mr. Ortiz, I actually just did explain the point algorithm, but unfortunately, we don't know how many points each of those things is going to be worth. So it could be that if you're the justice involved individual applying, you'll get 10 points, whereas if your parent applied, they would only get 5 points. Again, we don't know what the point totals are going to be or how any of that is going to work. But ultimately, what is going to happen is the state is going to rank everybody based on how many points they got, and then go through and award licenses to the top individuals in each region based on how you prioritized regions in your application. Now, there was a follow-on question there as to whether or not the business and the conviction had to be in the same person. And it does seem very clear from the guidance that we've gotten from the OCM that yes, indeed, the conviction and the business do need to be in the same person. So you can't do it where one person was convicted and someone else in the application with you had the qualifying business. The qualifying business and the justice involved individual must be one and the same. Or I guess you should say the justice involved individual must be the one that had the qualifying business. All right, let's go to a few other questions. Can an LLC apply if the requirements are met separately by its members? And I assume you're meaning for this license, which is opening tomorrow. And while you can have an LLC be the entity that is applying for that, and in that case, the justice involved individuals must own 51% of that LLC. If you've got more than one justice involved individual, the one that is qualifying with the qualifying business must be at least a 30% owner. So that kind of lays it out for you there. So it can be an LLC, but again, you got to have the justice involved individuals. The qualifying business must be with one of the justice involved individuals. That justice involved individual must own at least 30%, and all the justice involved individuals in the aggregate must own at least 51%. So if you've only got one justice involved individual, he or she must own 51% of the entity that we are talking about. All right, let's see what else we're going to get here. Let's go to a few other questions. Here's another great one related to the license tomorrow, and frankly, I think it'll matter for all of the licenses coming forward. If I hold a license, can my spouse apply for another license? So, what you may be familiar with from the license that is opening tomorrow is there's this concept of true persons of interest. And the Office of Cannabis Management is asking for a tremendous amount of information about these true persons of interest. So, that's going to be the main applicant, that is the justice involved individual that has the license. It's going to be any other stockholders in the entity. It's going to be officers of the entity. There's a whole host of individuals in the Office of Cannabis Management FAC as far as who will be true persons of interest in the entity. The spouse of many of those individuals that I listed will also be a true person of interest. So you need to look very carefully at that FAC from the Office of Cannabis Management so that you can see which individuals' spouses will also be considered a true person of interest. And so if you're a true person of interest, what that means is you're going to be limited similarly to whatever your spouse is limited to. So if you're getting a retail license, your spouse will not be able to apply for a cultivation license, assuming these same rules will apply, that the spouse of the true person of interest is also a true person of interest and therefore has to deal with all the same limitations and regulations as the individual applying. So you're going to want to look very carefully at the guidance as it's made available from the Office of Cannabis Management. But at least for tomorrow's license, the conditional adult use retail dispensary license, there are a number of people whose spouses will also be considered true persons of interest. So when it comes to dispensaries, they will also have the limit of 3 dispensaries, just like their spouse would. And that's not necessarily 3 dispensaries plus 3 dispensaries. It looks like that will very likely be 3 dispensaries between the 2 spouses. Of course, keep looking at the guidance that the Office of Cannabis Management gives you there, but it does look like, based on what we've seen so far, that that is how it's going to work out. All right, let's do one more question, and then I think we'll be done for the day. I've heard you use the terms upstream, downstream, and semi-verticalization when it comes to licensing. Can you explain that again? Sure, let's do that. And I'm also going to talk about that a bit in our presentation on Friday at NECAN. So the way the licenses worked out in the cannabis law and how the restrictions worked on what you could or couldn't apply for and what's going on, I think was a bit confusing, particularly for lay folks from the cannabis law. And so I wanted to simplify it a bit by talking about upstream, downstream, and special licenses. Those are kind of the 3 categories I have. And then also this category of what I call semi-verticalization. So for me, upstream licenses are all the licenses upstream of retail that you would normally think of. That is cultivation, processing, and distribution. And the reason I want to make that upstream and downstream difference is that if you're going to get an upstream license, you absolutely cannot get a downstream license. So I think that's where it's very comfortable and very helpful to think of those licenses in this way. So again, your upstream licenses are your cultivation, your processing, and your distribution. Your downstream licenses, or as you might otherwise call it, your retail licenses, are your dispensary licenses, your on-site consumption licenses, and your delivery licenses. Those are the 3 licenses, again, that I'm calling downstream to make them differentiate them from the upstream licenses. And then again, the key differential is if you get one of the upstream licenses, or you cannot get one of the downstream licenses. And the opposite of that is also true. If you get one of the downstream licenses, you cannot get one of the upstream licenses. So that's just a very important point to keep in mind. The other 3 special licenses, which we won't go into too much detail about right now, are the co-op license, the nursery license, and the micro business license. And yes, the micro business does have a little bit of retail possibly available to it. But again, it's just a very special license. And so I differentiate it from the downstream licenses, which are the normal straight up retail, retail licenses. Now, um, semi-verticalization. That's another term we've kind of brought up here. And we lawyers love exceptions to every rule that we make. So the one rule that's an exception to the one person, one entity, one license, particularly as it pertains to the upstream licenses, is that they are going to allow what we call semi-verticalization. And what we mean by that is, let's say you decide you want to get a cultivation license. In addition to that cultivation license, you will also be able to get one processing license and one distribution license, but you'll only be able to do processing and distribution of the cannabis that you grew with your cultivation license. And similarly, let's say you wanted to get a processing license, which would allow you to process anyone else's cannabis, and therefore you do not get a cultivation license. You will be able to get one distribution license, again, only for the cannabis which you process. So it does seem in that scenario, you'd be able to get flower from anybody you wanted, you would be able to process it, and then you would be able to distribute, but only the things that you processed underneath your processing license. So for me, that is what I'm calling semi-verticalization. As everyone knows, other than the registered organizations, which are the medical guys and the micro business, no other license is allowed to be allowed to be fully verticalized. I mentioned to you the cases where the upstream license are able to be semi-verticalized. And there is one other example where we do have semi-verticalization. That is the co-op license. The co-op can grow, process, and distribute, but it can't do retail. So that's another example of semi-verticalization. All right, I think that wraps it up for today's session. Just a reminder to everybody, we do this every Wednesday at 4:20. So by all means, please join us again next week. Just a reminder, we're double dipping this week. We are doing this session, which is ending right now, and we're also going to do a live Ask Me Anything at NECAN on Friday at 3:30 up in Albany. So again, half presentation, half Ask Me Anything. And also, as someone just mentioned in the comments, I'm also going to double dip next Wednesday. Before my Ask Me Anything session, we're going to be doing a group, I guess, presentation and discussion. A number of folks are going to be doing giving information. So me as an attorney, several other folks from other parts of the business. So that's going to be next Wednesday at, I believe it's at 3 p.m. Andrew, if you want to post the time in here, I might be missing it. It might be 2 p.m., but Andrew, go ahead and post the time in here so everybody sees it. So double dipping next Wednesday as well. Reminder, if you're not currently a connection of mine on LinkedIn, please reach out to me. Love to be your connection. Send me a request. And as I say every week, everyone is super excited that we're going to have a regulated cannabis industry here in New York very soon. But we got to remember that the justice issues, frankly, were the most important things that came out of the law. We got to get everybody's convictions expunged. We got to get everybody, every non-violent cannabis offender out of jail, if there are still any here in New York. And hopefully I'm going to find that out soon. As Andrew and Dylan said, my apologies. It is 2 p.m. next Wednesday for the first session, and then 4:20 p.m. For my regular Ask Me Anything, which will be, a couple hours after that session with Dylan and his crew. So absolutely want everyone to come to both of those sessions next Wednesday. And that's got it for today. So thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in Albany, or we'll see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Thank you, and have a good one.